Hezbollah had everything. 150,000 rockets pointed at Israel. Tens of thousands of fighters who had trained for decades for exactly this moment. Underground tunnels stretching for hundreds of kilometers beneath southern Lebanon. A military infrastructure that had survived 4 decades of Israeli airstrikes, assassinations, and Western sanctions. By every measurable standard, Hezbollah was the most powerful non-state military force in the history of the Middle East. And in the winter of 2026, it could not make a single strategic decision. Not because its weapons had been destroyed, not because its fighters had deserted, but because the people who told Hezbollah what it was fighting for, and what to do next, were gone. The military commander, the political leader, the Iranian officers who had been the living nerve connecting Beirut to Tehran for 40 years, removed one by one in careful sequence by Mossad, executing not a series of assassinations but a blueprint for total collapse, drawn up years in advance. How do you destroy an organization without touching its weapons? And what does Hezbollah become when the hand that built it finally lets go? This is the story of the most precise intelligence operation Mossad has ever executed against Iran's proxy network, and why its consequences are only beginning to unfold. Subscribe and turn on notifications. New video every single day. Targeted killings, covert wars, and the intelligence operations the world is still trying to understand. There is a detail about Hezbollah that almost every mainstream account gets wrong. Not through deliberate distortion, but through a word choice so habitual that no one questions it anymore. The word is backing. Iran backs Hezbollah. It implies a distance that never existed, a transaction. Money crosses a border, weapons follow, and the recipient organization makes its own decisions about what to do with both. Clean, simple, and almost entirely false. What the Islamic Republic built in Lebanon was not a client. It was a limb, an extension of Iranian strategic will, designed from its founding architecture to move in the direction Tehran intended, staffed by Lebanese men who believed deeply in their own cause, but directed at every moment of consequence by people whose loyalties ran not to Beirut, but to a desk in Tehran. The Quds Force, the branch of Iran's Revolutionary Guards built specifically to project Iranian power beyond Iranian borders, never operated from a distance when it came to Hezbollah. Its officers did not advise from afar. They lived in Lebanon. They rotated through operational hubs in the Bekaa Valley and the southern suburbs of Beirut. They attended command meetings, reviewed proposals, held direct lines to Tehran, and made sure that nothing of strategic significance moved without authorization from above. This was not a management structure grafted onto an existing organization. It was the organization's skeleton, present from the very first days, never removed, never loosened, never far from the room where decisions were made. That skeleton was assembled in the summer of 1982, in the aftermath of a war that Israel launched and Iran exploited with remarkable speed. When Israeli forces crossed into Lebanon on June 6, 1982, the stated purpose was military: destroy the Palestine Liberation Organization's infrastructure in the south, eliminate the rocket threat to northern Israel, push the PLO out of striking range. The campaign achieved parts of its objective. What it also produced, as a consequence no Israeli planner had fully modeled, was precisely the conditions Tehran needed. 400,000 Shia civilians displaced, 80% of villages in the south destroyed, an entire population with no political voice, no state protection, and nothing left to lose. Khomeini moved within weeks. Approximately 1,500 IRGC personnel, trainers, commanders, veterans hardened by years of the Iran-Iraq War, arrived in Lebanon's eastern Bekaa Valley. Their task was not to fight. Their task was to build something that would fight permanently on Iran's behalf. The organization they built eventually published its founding principles in an open letter in February of 1985, but it had been operational since 1982. By the time that letter appeared, Hezbollah had already killed 241 American servicemen and 58 French paratroopers in the Beirut barracks bombings of October 1983, the deadliest single attack on American military personnel since the Second World War. And the Quds Force structure inside it had already set into place the command, financial, and logistics architecture that would define the organization for the next 4 decades. That architecture proved its resilience almost immediately, and in a way that should have told Israel everything it needed to know about what it was actually fighting. In February of 1992, Israeli forces killed Hezbollah's Secretary General, Abbas al-Musawi, in a helicopter strike in southern Lebanon. The logic was sound. Remove the leader, degrade the organization. What followed was the opposite of degradation. Within days, Hezbollah had a new Secretary General, a 31-year-old cleric named Hassan Nasrallah, relatively unknown outside the organization's inner circle, who would go on to lead Hezbollah for the next 32 years and transform it into a far more capable force than al-Musawi had ever built. The Iranian architecture did not flinch. The money kept moving. The Quds Force officers in Beirut stayed at their posts. A new operator had been found before the old one was buried. The second lesson came in February of 2008. Imad Mubniya, the operational architect behind the barracks bombings, the man responsible for more American deaths than any individual before the September 11th attacks, was assassinated in Damascus. Hezbollah absorbed the blow, reorganized around his absence, and continued functioning at the same level of capability. Same outcome, same reason. The Iranian architecture connecting Beirut to Tehran remained completely untouched. Mossad studied both recoveries with precision. The conclusion was stark. You cannot break a proxy force by replacing the person at its head as long as the hand directing it from above remains intact. The Quds Force presence in Lebanon, the officers, the financial channels, the weapons pipelines, the human chain of command was not a feature of Hezbollah. It was the source of its resilience, and it had never once been made the primary target. That became the premise of what followed. Not an assassination campaign with a list of names. A demolition, sequenced, patient, designed so that each removal would expose the layer beneath it before that layer had any time to compensate. The military leadership first, the political symbols second, the Iranian officers themselves last, the living threads that had always connected the force in Beirut to the mind in Tehran. The trigger arrived on July 27, 2024. A rocket hit a football field in the village of Majd al-Shams in the Golan Heights. 12 children were killed. The man whose unit fired that rocket had been tracked by Israeli intelligence for years, a figure so deeply embedded in Hezbollah's military command that removing him had always carried a political cost too high to pay in ordinary times. These were no longer ordinary times. He had 3 days left, and within hours of his death, something else happened, thousands of kilometers away, in a guest house in Tehran, that made clear this was not a reaction to a provocation. It was the first move of a sequence that had already been planned to its final conclusion. For more than 20 years, Fuad Shukr had the rare distinction of being simultaneously one of the most dangerous men in the Middle East and one of the least photographed. The FBI had placed him on its most wanted list. The United States government had put a price on his head. Israeli intelligence had tracked his movements, mapped his networks, and assessed his operational role with the kind of precision reserved for targets at the very top of the threat hierarchy. And for decades, none of it had translated into the one outcome that actually mattered. He stayed alive. He stayed operational. And he stayed at the center of Hezbollah's military architecture, as though the attention aimed at him simply did not exist. Shukr, known inside the organization by his operational name, Haj Musen, was not a commander in the conventional military sense. He was one of the original architects, a man who had been present at the construction of Hezbollah's military infrastructure from the very beginning, who had survived every intelligence campaign and every generational shift the organization had gone through since 1982. By the summer of 2024, he occupied a position that had no clean equivalent in any conventional military hierarchy: Chief Military Advisor to Hassan Nasrallah, de facto head of the organization's strategic planning apparatus, and the primary human bridge between Hezbollah's operational command and the IRGC officers whose authorization every major decision required. That last function, the living connection between Hezbollah's field command and the Iranian chain of authority above it, was what made him genuinely irreplaceable, in a way his formal title did not fully capture. Nasrallah set political direction. The Quds Force provided authorization and resources. Shukr was the mechanism through which those two layers communicated in operational terms. Remove him, and you did not simply lose a general. You removed the transmission system that made the entire command structure function as a coherent unit. Israeli intelligence had understood this for years. The problem was that understanding a target and acquiring a target are entirely different problems, and for Fuad Shukr, the acquisition problem had never been cleanly solved. He was meticulous about personal security in a way that most senior Hezbollah figures were not. He avoided fixed routines. He operated through layers of intermediaries that made confirming his physical location at any given moment an exercise in sustained uncertainty. The intelligence picture around him had never been clean enough, for long enough, to justify the political cost of a precision strike inside the Dahia, Beirut's southern suburbs, the most fortified and politically sensitive territory Hezbollah controlled. July of 2024 changed that calculation entirely. On the afternoon of the 27th, a rocket struck a football field in the Druze village of Majd al-Shams in the Golan Heights. 12 children were killed. Dozens more were wounded, many of them teenagers who had simply been watching a game minutes before the impact. The attack produced an immediate and overwhelming political demand inside Israel for a response that left no ambiguity about accountability. Hezbollah denied responsibility. Israeli military intelligence assessed otherwise, tracing the rocket to a unit operating under Shukr's direct command. The denial changed nothing. It made the response more certain. What shifted was not the intelligence picture. Shukr had been a priority target for years. What shifted was the political threshold. The deaths of 12 children created a window in which a strike at the heart of the Dahia became politically executable in a way it simply had not been the week before. And the targeting package that Israeli intelligence had spent years building and maintaining was ready to be used the moment that window opened. The strike came 3 days later, on the evening of July 30th. Precision munitions hit a building in the Haret Harik neighborhood of the Dahia, the same district Hezbollah had spent decades fortifying with tunnels, command posts, and protected infrastructure specifically designed to make operations like this one prohibitively costly. The building collapsed. Fuad Shukr was killed inside it. The assessment from within the Israeli security establishment was precise. His death represented the most significant blow to Hezbollah's military command since the assassination of Imad Mughniya 16 years earlier. That comparison was not rhetorical. Mughniya had been the operational brain of the organization's external attack capability. Shukr was the brain of its strategic command, the man who had translated Iranian authorization into Hezbollah planning for over 2 decades. Neither function had a natural successor waiting in an obvious position. Neither loss was the kind the militia could absorb without visible disruption to its command architecture. But July 30th did not end in Beirut, because within hours of the strike on Haret Harik, something else was happening. In a guest house in the northern Tehran neighborhood of Shamiran, thousands of kilometers from Lebanon. A senior figure had arrived in the Iranian capital to attend the inauguration of the country's new president. He had arrived under Iranian state protection, in a compound the regime had personally secured. It was not enough. Ismail Haniyeh, the political chief of Hamas, the Palestinian organization Iran funded alongside Hezbollah as a core element of its regional proxy network, was killed in a precision strike on his guest house in the early hours of July 31st. Iran's security apparatus, which had personally guaranteed his protection, could not explain what had penetrated the compound or who had placed the device. Tehran announced his death and blamed Israel. Israel said nothing. 2 operations, 2 countries, within hours of each other. The timing was not coincidental. It was a signal. Not a reaction to a provocation, but the opening of something already planned to a conclusion that had not yet been revealed. Hezbollah had lost the man who turned Tehran's strategic direction into battlefield reality. Hamas had lost its political chief. And Iran's intelligence services had been exposed as incapable of protecting the guests sleeping inside their own compounds. The military brain was gone. What remained was the symbol, the man whose face every Hezbollah fighter had looked to for 32 years, whose voice had defined what the organization believed it was fighting for, whose survival had become, in the minds of his followers, proof that the organization itself could not be broken. He was already underground, 60 feet below the streets of Beirut in a reinforced bunker built to survive exactly what had just killed his most trusted general. He had every reason to believe the concrete above him was enough. He was wrong. And the people who had just killed Fuad Shukr already knew precisely where to find him. There is a specific kind of leader that an organization produces once, the kind whose authority does not come from a title or a formal appointment, but from something harder to define and impossible to manufacture on demand. Hassan Nasrallah was that kind of leader. He had held the position of Hezbollah's Secretary General for 32 years. But that number alone does not capture what he actually represented to the organization, to Lebanon's Shia population, or to the broader Arab world that had watched him survive again and again everything Israel had thrown at him. He was not just a commander. He was proof. Proof that Hezbollah could not be broken. Proof that the Islamic Republic's project in Lebanon had outlasted every attempt to destroy it. Proof, delivered in a televised address after every Israeli campaign, every failed assassination attempt, every round of sanctions, that the hand holding the militia was still there, still steady, still pointing in the same direction. For his followers, Nasrallah's continued existence was not merely a biographical fact. It was an argument. As long as he was alive, the organization's claim to be undefeatable had a face. Remove that face, and the argument had to be rebuilt from scratch around someone who had never earned the same weight. Israeli intelligence understood this completely. Nasrallah had been a priority target since the 1990s, a figure whose removal had been wargamed, planned for, and abandoned repeatedly because the operational cost of reaching him had always been prohibitive. He lived underground. Not metaphorically, literally. After the 2006 war with Israel, he had not appeared in public for years at a time, conducting the organization's affairs from a fortified network of tunnels and bunkers beneath the southern suburbs of Beirut, surrounded by the dense civilian infrastructure of the Dahiya that any strike against him would inevitably affect. The protection was not accidental. It was architectural, designed specifically to make his elimination a political and military calculation too costly to execute on most days. By September of 2024, those days had run out. What Israeli intelligence had acquired, through a combination of signals collection, surveillance, and human source reporting, the full details of which have never been officially confirmed, was the precise location of a command meeting Nasrallah was attending beneath Hezbollah's headquarters complex in the Dahiya. He was inside a reinforced bunker more than 18 meters underground, a structure built specifically to survive conventional airstrikes and designed around the assumption that no available munition could reliably penetrate that depth of reinforced concrete. That assumption had been reasonable for most of Hezbollah's history. It was no longer reasonable in 2024. The strike came on the evening of September 27th. The Israeli Air Force delivered a succession of precision bunker-piercing munitions to the target site. Weapons specifically engineered to defeat hardened underground structures by punching through layer after layer of reinforced concrete before detonating at depth. The building above the bunker ceased to exist. Then the next layer down ceased to exist. Then the next. The explosive sequence was calculated to ensure that the pressure wave reached the command level regardless of how many meters of concrete lay between the surface and the chamber below. Nasrallah was inside that chamber. So were several of his senior commanders, including Ali Karaki, the commander of Hezbollah's southern front and one of the most operationally significant figures in the organization's military structure. None of them survived. What the forensic examination of the recovered bodies revealed was striking in its own way. Nasrallah showed no obvious external wounds, no shrapnel, no burns. He had been killed by the concussive force of the pressure wave itself, the shock wave that propagated through the bunker at a velocity and intensity the reinforced walls had been designed to resist, but not at the magnitude delivered that night. A structure built to protect him had become the thing that killed him, channeling and amplifying the wave rather than absorbing it. Hezbollah confirmed his death on September 28th. The announcement came not from a press conference, not from a statement delivered by a senior official in front of cameras, but through a message released by the organization's media office. Brief, formal, stripped of the defiant rhetoric that had characterized every previous communication in the weeks of fighting that preceded it. The brevity was itself telling. A movement that had spent 32 years projecting confidence from the top did not know yet how to project it from anywhere else. The regional reaction arrived quickly, and it said more about the political architecture Nasrallah had inhabited than any eulogy could. Condolences flowed from Tehran. Statements of solidarity came from allied factions across the region. The language was defiant, resolute, and carefully constructed to signal continuity. What it could not conceal was the absence at its center, the person who had made every critical decision, authorized every major operation, and served as the living embodiment of what the organization claimed to be, was gone. And unlike 1992, when al-Musawi's death had produced Nasrallah as an unexpected replacement, there was no figure waiting in an equivalent position. No one who carried the same weight, no one who had earned the same trust from both the organization's fighters and the Iranian command above them. Tehran's response to that vacancy was swift and, in retrospect, exactly what Mossad had anticipated. Within weeks of the ceasefire that followed in November of 2024, Iran began deploying additional Quds Force officers to Lebanon. Not in small numbers. Estimates from Western intelligence agencies placed the figure at approximately 100 officers, a significant expansion of the existing presence, designed to provide the command continuity that Nasrallah's death had severed. The Islamic Republic had lost its most important operator in Lebanon. Its answer was to insert the Iranian hand more directly than it had ever done before, effectively taking operational control of a proxy force that had always been directed by Tehran but had, under Nasrallah, maintained the appearance of autonomous leadership. It was a logical response. It was also, from Mossad's perspective, precisely the move that had been expected, because an expanded Quds Force presence in Lebanon did not solve the problem Israel had identified. It created a larger, more clearly defined target set, more officers, more command infrastructure, more threads connecting Beirut to Tehran. And every one of those threads was now on a list. The ceasefire of November 2024 gave Iran a window to rebuild. Israel used the same window for something else entirely. And what neither side acknowledged publicly during those months was the operational reality underneath the diplomatic surface. The ceasefire had paused the visible war. The invisible one had never stopped. What Iran thought it was building during those months, and what Israel was actually watching, is where this story takes its darkest turn. A ceasefire is not peace. The fighting stops, the cameras move on, and underneath the diplomatic language, both sides do exactly what both sides always do. They prepare for what comes next. The agreement that halted the fighting between Israel and Hezbollah on November 27, 2024 was, on paper, a conventional ceasefire arrangement brokered with American and French involvement. Hezbollah would pull back from the border zone. The Lebanese army would deploy south. Israel would withdraw its ground forces. The provisions were familiar. The underlying reality was not. Hezbollah had entered the ceasefire having lost its Secretary General, its most senior military commander, its Southern Front chief, and significant portions of the command infrastructure it had spent years building in southern Lebanon. The organization was not defeated. Its weapons were largely intact. Its fighters had not surrendered. But its leadership layer had been gutted in a way that made coherent strategic decision-making functionally impossible without direct Iranian intervention. Tehran recognized this immediately, and Tehran's response revealed more clearly than anything that had come before just how completely the Islamic Republic viewed Hezbollah as its own proxy rather than an independent partner. Within weeks of the ceasefire, Iran began deploying Quds Force officers to Lebanon at a scale that exceeded anything seen during Nasrallah's tenure. Western intelligence agencies estimated the figure at approximately 100 officers, a number that represented not a supplement to the existing command structure, but a replacement for it. The pretense of Hezbollah as an autonomous organization, always thin, was effectively abandoned. IRGC officers assumed direct operational control over the military command processes that Hezbollah's own commanders had previously managed. Planning meetings now had Iranian officers not merely present, but presiding. The financial channels were restructured under tighter IRGC oversight. The weapons pipeline, partially disrupted by the preceding months of fighting, was being rebuilt under direct Iranian supervision. What Tehran appears not to have fully calculated was that the ceasefire had not stopped Israeli intelligence from watching every step of that recovery in real time. Between November of 2024 and February of 2026, Israeli strikes killed more than 400 Hezbollah operatives inside Lebanon, despite the nominal ceasefire. These were not random strikes. They were targeted. Commanders, logistics coordinators, weapons depot managers, the specific individuals responsible for rebuilding the military infrastructure Israel had degraded during the preceding conflict. Each one removed at a moment designed to slow reconstruction without triggering the kind of large-scale escalation that would have collapsed the ceasefire entirely. The political surface of the agreement was maintained. The operational reality beneath it was that Israel had never stopped working through the target list. And then, on February 28, 2026, the political surface cracked entirely. The Israeli operation that killed Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, that night, the opening strike of what the Israeli military designated Operation Epic Fury, fundamentally altered every calculation on every side of every conflict in the region simultaneously. For Hezbollah, the death of Khamenei was not simply the loss of a distant political figure. It was the severing of the ultimate authority in the chain of command that had given the organization its strategic direction for decades. With him gone, the Quds Force officers in Beirut suddenly found themselves embedded in a force they controlled operationally, but receiving strategic direction from a command structure in Tehran that was itself in the process of disintegrating. Hezbollah's response came 2 days later. On March 2, 2026, the organization launched a significant barrage of rockets and missiles into northern Israel, framed publicly as retaliation for Khamenei's killing, a declaration that the ceasefire had ended and that Hezbollah was still capable of offensive action regardless of what had happened to its leadership. The message was aimed as much at its own fighters and the Lebanese Shia population as it was at Israel. It was a statement of continued existence, a signal that the force still functioned.
Israel's response made clear that the ceasefire had been, from its side, a temporary arrangement, rather than a strategic endpoint. Within 72 hours of Hezbollah's barrage, the Israeli Air Force had struck more than 500 targets across Lebanon: weapons depots, command posts, rocket launch sites, logistical infrastructure, and the specific locations where Quds Force officers had been identified operating in the preceding weeks. The scale of the campaign, compressed into 4 days between March 2nd and 6th, was designed not merely to neutralize the immediate threat, but to collapse the rebuilt command architecture that Iran had spent 16 months assembling under ceasefire cover. Everything Tehran had constructed since November of 2024 was now a target set. But the strikes between March 2nd and 6th were not the most consequential thing Israel did that week.
The most consequential thing was quieter, more precise, and aimed not at warehouses or launch sites, but at the specific individuals whose presence in Lebanon was the only thing keeping what remained of Hezbollah's command architecture connected to what remained of Iran's. The Quds Force officers, the financial liaisons, the men whose encrypted communications had for 16 months been the living thread connecting a militia in Beirut to a strategic decision-making process in Tehran. Every one of them had been tracked, every movement logged, every communication pattern mapped against a database that Israeli signals intelligence had been building since long before the ceasefire began. By the second week of March, that database had become an execution list, and the executions were about to begin in the most visible location possible. Not in a tunnel, not in a border village, but inside a hotel in the center of Beirut, where several of the most senior Iranian officers in Lebanon had apparently concluded that the chaos of the renewed conflict provided sufficient cover for a meeting that would have been unthinkable to hold openly 6 months earlier. They were wrong, and the consequences of that miscalculation would, in the space of 72 hours, complete what the killing of Shukr and Nasrallah had only begun. Pressure does something predictable to even the most disciplined intelligence officers. When everything around them is collapsing, the instinct is to gather, to put the remaining decision-makers in the same room so that what is left of the coordination machinery can function before it degrades further. It feels like discipline. In March of 2026, it was a death sentence. The Quds Force officers who had arrived in Lebanon after the November ceasefire were not careless men. They had operated in hostile intelligence environments before. They understood, in the abstract, that Israeli signals collection was sophisticated and Israeli targeting was precise. But abstract understanding and operational discipline are different things, and the events of late February and early March had produced exactly the kind of pressure that erodes the gap between them. The first serious blow to the rebuilt Iranian command structure in Lebanon had come even before the ceasefire collapsed. On February 20th, 2026, 8 days before Operation Epic Fury began in Iran, Israeli strikes targeted a location in the Bekaa Valley where Quds Force officers had gathered alongside senior Hezbollah commanders for a coordination meeting. The location had been under surveillance long enough for the pattern of gatherings to become predictable. The strike hit during the meeting rather than before or after it, maximizing the damage to the command layer present rather than simply destroying the building and leaving its occupants intact. The message was clear to anyone paying attention. The ceasefire had not created a sanctuary. The surveillance had never stopped. And the reconstruction effort Iran had been running for 16 months had been observed in far more detail than anyone in Tehran or Beirut had assumed. What followed in the first 2 weeks of March was aimed not at Hezbollah's infrastructure, but at the specific human nodes that constituted the living connection between what remained of the militia in Lebanon and what remained of Iran's chain of command. Not a continuation of pressure, a different operation entirely, more precise, more personal, and more final. On March 8th, Israeli aircraft struck the Ramada Hotel in Beirut. The choice of target carried a message that went beyond the immediate objective.
A hotel in the center of the city, not a tunnel complex, not a weapons depot, not a fortified compound in the Dahia, signaled that the operating assumption of the Quds Force officers had been wrong. The assumption that urban civilian infrastructure provided cover, that a meeting held in a commercial building rather than a known military site was invisible to Israeli targeting, turned out to be as mistaken as the assumption that a bunker 18 meters underground was deep enough to protect Hassan Nasrallah. 5 senior Quds Force officials died in that strike. Among them were figures whose specific functions within the command architecture made their removal disproportionately damaging relative to their rank. One was a senior intelligence liaison, the officer responsible for managing the flow of intelligence between Hezbollah's command and the Iranian security apparatus, the human processor through which the two organizations synchronized their understanding of the operational environment. Another was a financial officer, the individual through whom the funding architecture that sustained Hezbollah's operations, its weapons procurement, and its social services network was managed and directed. These were not symbolic figures. They were the specific human mechanisms through which the command architecture functioned at the level below strategy, the people who made the decisions that strategy required actually executable. 3 days later, on March 11th, Israeli strikes in southern Lebanon killed the senior commanders of the IRGC-linked Imam Hussein Division, the unit that had served as one of the primary structural links between the Iranian military presence in Lebanon and Hezbollah's own field command. The division had been one of the key instruments through which Iran had attempted to reconstitute Hezbollah's military command after the losses of 2024. Its commanders had been present in Lebanon for months, building relationships with surviving Hezbollah field officers and attempting to establish the kind of institutional continuity that Nasrallah's death had destroyed. Those commanders were now gone. The cumulative effect of the strikes between March 2nd and March 11th was not simply a body count. It was the systematic removal of every functional layer of the command interface between Hezbollah and Tehran. The intelligence liaison who had synchronized the two organizations' understanding of the battlefield, gone. The financial officer who had managed the movement of Iranian money into Hezbollah's operational budget, gone. The division commanders who had been rebuilding the structural military connection between the IRGC and Hezbollah field units, gone. What remained in Beirut were commanders who held rank, controlled fighters, and sat above warehouses filled with weapons, but who had no functioning line to the Iranian command structure that had always told them what those weapons were for. The organization was not destroyed. Its weapons were still in the warehouses. The fighters were still in the tunnels and the border villages and the Bekaa Valley. The political network that gave Hezbollah its grip on Lebanon's Shia population, the schools, the hospitals, the social services, was still physically present, even if the money sustaining it had become uncertain. Hezbollah, as a physical fact, had not been erased. What had been erased was its coherence as a fighting force. The difference between an armed organization and an army is not weapons or manpower. It is the command architecture that converts both into coordinated strategic action. The ability to decide, authorize, communicate, and execute. That architecture had been built by Iran over 4 decades, maintained by Iranian officers permanently embedded in Lebanon, and sustained by financial flows that ran through Iranian hands at every level. Every one of those elements had now been targeted, in sequence, at the precise moment designed to leave the next layer without the support it would have needed to compensate for the loss of the one before it. Mossad had not dismantled Hezbollah. It had dismantled Iran's ability to operate it. And in an organization that had never learned to function without that capability, because it had never needed to, the distinction barely mattered. What happens to 150,000 rockets when the organization holding them no longer knows who it answers to, and whether anyone is coming to give new orders? The most dangerous moment for any armed organization is not when it is being destroyed. It is when it is trying to decide what it is.
Hezbollah, in the spring of 2026, faces exactly that moment. The weapons are there. The fighters are there. The political network embedded in Lebanon's Shia communities, the schools, the clinics, the welfare offices that have given the organization its social legitimacy for decades, is still physically present. But the framework that told all of those elements what they were part of, what they were pointed toward, and who had the authority to direct them, that framework is gone. And in its absence, the organization is not simply weakened. It is something more unsettling than weakened. It is undefined. 3 futures are possible. None of them is clean.
The first is fragmentation. Hezbollah was never monolithic beneath its public face of unity. It contained distinct power centers whose competing interests had always been managed, rather than resolved, by Nasrallah's authority and the Iranian command structure above him. The Bekaa Valley commanders, who built their influence around weapons infrastructure and the smuggling networks that funded portions of the organization's operations, had always operated with practical autonomy, the formal command politely ignored. The political leadership in Beirut, which spent decades managing parliamentary relationships and alliances with other Lebanese factions, had interests that did not always align with the military command's appetite for escalation. Nasrallah held these tensions together. He is gone. The question of whether the organization fractures along those fault lines, producing not one Hezbollah but several competing entities with different agendas, is one no outside analyst can answer, because it depends on internal dynamics deliberately hidden from view. The second is functional autonomy, a Hezbollah that survives as a coherent organization but learns, out of necessity, to operate without Tehran's direction. This would be the most historically significant transformation the organization has ever undergone. It has never had to develop genuine internal decision-making capacity, precisely because that capacity was always provided from outside. Building it now, under military pressure, with a leadership layer assembled in a hurry to fill the gaps left by the killings of 2024, is an institutional challenge of the highest order. But the human material is there. The fighters are experienced. And the political motivation, a Lebanon-rooted Shia nationalism that exists independently of any Iranian directive, was never manufactured by Tehran. It was always real. The question is whether it is sufficient to organize an armed force without the external architecture that has always done the organizing. The third is reconstitution under a rebuilt Iranian command. Iran has not ceased to exist. A successor to Khamenei who stabilizes the internal situation could, in principle, attempt to re-establish the Quds Force presence in Lebanon and resume the strategic direction that has been severed. But the timeline for that, if it happens at all, is measured in years, and the environment it would be rebuilding into. A Lebanon where Hezbollah's credibility has been visibly shaken, where the Lebanese state is asserting itself in the south for the first time in decades, and where Israel has demonstrated a willingness to strike commercial hotels in central Beirut, is fundamentally different from the environment that made the original construction possible in 1982. One of these trajectories carries a risk that almost no mainstream account has stated directly. A Hezbollah controlled by Tehran was predictable. It escalated when Iran wanted escalation. It held back when Iran wanted restraint. The ceasefire of 2024 existed in part because Tehran calculated that full-scale war was not, at that moment, in its interest, and Hezbollah held to the ceasefire because it was told to. That kind of rational restraint requires a command structure capable of exercising it. Remove the command structure, and you do not remove the weapons or the willingness to use them. You remove the mechanism that previously decided when not to use them. A Hezbollah making decisions without Iranian oversight is an organization operating on shorter time horizons, local pressures, and the internal politics of a faction struggling to maintain its relevance inside Lebanon. Less strategically coherent, perhaps, but less predictable in exactly the ways that make deterrence difficult to maintain.
Mossad understood this trade-off when it designed the operation. The decision to dismantle the Iranian command architecture was made on the assessment that a coherent Iranian-directed Hezbollah with 150,000 rockets represented a more severe long-term threat than a fragmented or disoriented one, even accounting for the unpredictability that fragmentation introduces.
Whether that assessment proves correct is a question that will be answered not in an intelligence briefing, but in the events of the next several years. What is not in question is what was accomplished. Over 18 months, from the killing of Fuad Shukr in July of 2024 to the elimination of the Quds Force command layer in March of 2026, Israel systematically removed every element of the architecture that had made Hezbollah what it was. Not the weapons, not the fighters, the mind, the money, the chain of authority that had run, uninterrupted, from a decision made in Tehran to a rocket launched from the Bekaa Valley for 4 decades. The organization that remains is heavily armed, politically embedded, and genuinely dangerous. It is also, for the first time in its history, alone. What it builds from that isolation, and what it becomes in the years ahead, is the most consequential open question in the Middle East right now. You can dismantle an architecture. You cannot determine what grows in its place. If this kind of story is what you come here for, subscribe and turn on notifications. New video every single day.